We've got a marvelous program here today, and I'd like to invite our first speaker this morning, Mr. Speaker, in fact. Those of you may not recognize this gentleman, although I suspect most of you do. The Honorable Bill OBrien, former Speaker of the House, like many of us, an import to New Hampshire. You don't need any introduction, so I'm not going to do that. Mr. Speaker, thank you. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank Susan for organizing this and to putting me on a program with such illustrious people speaking here. But rather than try to list them all and forget some of them, what I want to do is to acknowledge all of you for being here and helping us protect our Second Amendment rights. So I thank all of you for your presence today. I also want to join Susan in providing a brief history of the Second Amendment. And it does take us back to the year of 1776, because the year 1776 was the best of years and the worst of years for our American Republic. It started the year by ousting the foreigners from Boston. In July of that year, it declared our independence. But by the fall of 1776, the Continental Army under George Washington was on the ropes. The year before, the Army had amazed the world by standing up to the finest army in the world, the British Army, and inflicting serious losses on the British Army at Bunker Hill. And these were armed citizens, as Susan said. A militia stood up to that army. And earlier in the year 1776, that army occupied Dorchester Heights and ousted the British from Boston, sent their war vessels to sea, threw the army out of most of New England. But 6 months later, Washington and the remnants of that army, a few thousand and ragged men, stood on the snow on the banks of the Delaware River in Pennsylvania, waiting for the British Army to deal them a death blow. The Continental Army at that point had suffered numerous defeats. It had been defeated in the Battle of Brooklyn on Long Island. It had been pushed onto the island of Manhattan and had been thrown off of Manhattan. It had been chased the length of New Jersey down again to the banks of Delaware. And having defeated, although not quite broken, the American Army, the British started doing something that was very successful for them over the years. They started doing to America what they had done to Ireland and Scotland. As recently as 30 years before, in the Jacobite rebellion that the British had put down, they started terrorizing the population. And so, in 1776, the British brought their policy of rape and pillaging to American farmers. But these weren't Irish and Scottish peasants. These were pioneers who had a tradition of self-defense in a sometimes hostile land. These farmers had what Chicago and New York liberals today would call, and even country club Republicans would call, they were armed to the teeth. And when the British Army came to their farms, these farmers took a bite out of the British Army. Within weeks, the armed and outraged resistance of New Jersey farmers relegated the British Army, again, the finest army in the world, to garrison towns along the road from New York to Trenton. The British found that they could leave those forts only in groups of 500 soldiers, and even then they lost hundreds of soldiers to armed New Jersey farmers in what's become known since then as the Forage War. Accounts come down to us of redcoat parties, foraging parties, of 100 men leaving those forts and 30 coming back. 50 men foraging parties left and never were seen again. The fighting strength of the British Army in New Jersey was cut in half. Those New Jersey farmers killed more British soldiers in the year 1776 than did Washington's army. We have to learn this history, and we have to teach this history because it is the reason for the language in our Constitution. Our founding fathers, whose lives and struggles were saved by an armed citizenry, never wanted a country where the citizens were not armed. As our founding fathers sat in Philadelphia with a ragtag army standing between them and the finest army of the world, they knew that if the revolution was lost, their lives were lost. They knew, in fact, and not in theory, that freedom is founded on the right and the ability of each of us to defend ourselves, not just against criminals, but against the possibility of official oppression. So 15 years later, when these same individuals, these individuals who sat in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1776, came together again in Philadelphia and said, what should be in this Constitution of ours? They understood that they didn't fight a revolution in order to allow a new government to come in place and take away the rights that they had traded, in many instances, their fortune and their own lives for. So they put, as they drafted the Constitution, they put the rights in order of importance. They first drafted the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. And there they said, of course, no one can take away our right to worship our God, and they can't take away our right to speak. They knew that there were some other important rights that had to be brought up next. There was a right of due process. There was a right to be secure in our homes. There was a right to a speedy jury trial and the intervention of our neighbors in a grand jury if the government was going to charge us. They knew that there was a right not to have your property taken by the government without fair compensation. But before they got to those rights, they knew that they had to express, they had to put into the Bill of Rights what was the foundational right of our freedom. They knew that they had to say to us across the ages and to future government officials, do not infringe on the people's rights to keep and bear arms. They said in that Second Amendment that our personal right to keep and bear arms is necessary for the security of a free state because they knew it. They had seen that. They explained in their words that arms should be available to all of us. This personal right would make sure that we all had arms so that when the enemies of freedom, whether external or internal, appeared, that each of us could protect our freedom. Our founders knew that they would have lost their lives if the revolution had failed. They also knew that the revolution would have failed if the armed populace of New Jersey and throughout the country had not had the means of self-defense and could not form instantaneous militias to defend their homes. So they first protected the right of worship. They first protected the right to speak. And then they put in the Constitution these words: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Let you and I, today at this rally, and at every opportunity that we have, and every ballot that we mark, make sure that we don't have our rights and the rights of future generations to keep and bear arms and preserve our freedom maintained. Thank you.
Rock TV.